Um, Today we're going to be talking about a cyber arms race. And we're going to talk more specifically about how this includes a concept called hybrid warfare for strategic deterrence between Israel and Iran. So this is something that Ben and I put together, and my name is Mila Paul. I have a PhD in cyber operations, and Ben, do you want to introduce yourself? I think there's something going on with your audio.
Yep. Hello, everybody. My name is Ben Varlies. I'm currently in my third year as a doctoral student in global security at American Military University. I served in the military for 17 years, doing a lot of small unit tactics, asymmetrical warfare type things. But I also got a graduate certificate in cybersecurity, and Dr. Paul and I became very interested in this topic, and decided to give this presentation to you guys today.
Hey, great. Ben, would you like to go ahead with our objectives for today?
Yep. Can we do next slide?
Yes. Do you see it?
No, it's still on the title slide.
Huh.
Here, I think I have.
Oh, hold on. I'm going to do this again.
There we go. All right. So our objectives for this presentation is to cover kind of the history of tension between Iran and Israel, to put how this cyber arms race kind of developed and evolved. We're also going to touch on the current state of the arms race, what we foresee or hypothesize for the future with this kind of cyber arms race, and then also kind of discuss why it's important to bring this to light in this both academically and for global security theories and principles.
Oops.
All right. So we're kind of going to lead out with, again, the history of the tension. Or Dr. Paul, did you want to run with this one?
Yeah, go ahead. I'll go ahead. Sorry. Okay, so I'd like to introduce this talk with some background on what we can consider a state-sponsored arms race. So what seems to have begun as a nuclear arms race in the late 70s has shifted to the cyber arena as we look at the ramifications of a computer worm called Stuxnet, and we're going to go into that a little deeper about a decade ago. So we're going to go a little deeper into this topic as we follow this timeline. Okay, so after the US-backed Shah of Iran was overthrown in the Islamic Revolution, Iran became prominent in the Islamic world. The state-sponsored rivalry is said to have begun after the Islamic Revolution in 1979, which made Iran's leader Khomeini, which made Iran a leader of the Islamic world. And Iran-backed groups all over the Middle Eastern region, to include Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, to resist against a perceived foreign domination caused by Israel using the concept of mukawama. Mukawama is commonly used to describe anti-Israel sentiments, and its perceived oppression against Islam is exemplified in the Palestinian and Israeli conflict. So all in all, the reasons for this conflict seem to be geopolitical, sociopolitical, and religious. Do you have anything to add to that, Ben?
No, you covered it pretty well there, Dr. Paul.
All right, thanks. Okay, so, oops. All right. So, Israel's first nuclear facility became operational in 1960, and it's unclear whether they are in possession of nuclear armaments, although it is said that they may have something around 80 to 90 nuclear warheads. But again, that is not something that is public, like information that's publicly available. Iran's first nuclear facility started around the same time and was backed by the US, became operational in 1967. Iran's possession of nuclear armaments is also unclear. However, they have continued nuclear activities despite US sanctions, which has caused a lot of concern. Okay, so after the Islamic Revolution, the US stopped funding Iran's nuclear capabilities. But in 2002, it was discovered that Iran had a uranium enrichment facility. So typically these facilities are supposed to be declared to the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA. The IAEA is kind of like an international nuclear watchdog. So these uranium enrichment facilities are typically used as a precursor to creating nuclear armaments. So it was possible and a great concern to the UN that Iran was advancing in its nuclear capabilities and by the use of weapons. So since this program's been carried out in secret, and as it was not reported to the IAEA, it was continued in defiance of the UN's diplomatic resolution, and that was why there was so much concern. So now we have Stuxnet. Okay, so now we're moving forward to 2010, and that which was just a decade ago. So Stuxnet is a cyber attack that targeted Iran's nuclear enrichment facility in 2010. It was a covert attack, and it was allegedly conducted by the United States and Israel. So the motive for this attack was to disrupt Iran's nuclear program. And part of Stuxnet's function was actually to cause the centrifuges that were used in uranium enrichment to fail. So Stuxnet is estimated to have damaged about 1,000 centrifuges, and that was attributed to, it definitely slowed down the program by several months to a year. So moving forward into what conventional weapons are. So conventional weapons, which have been used in wars in the past, they include firearms, artillery, bombs, explosives, rockets, missiles, grenades, mines, etc. So these cause damage by explosive and kinetic energy. So typically, the use of conventional weapons are subject to international law and rules of engagement. So, and the last thing and very important thing about conventional weapons is that it causes significant infrastructural damage. It can destroy entire cities. It can hit civilian targets. there's no precision in who it hits. So you end up with a lot of civilian casualties and fatalities. So now I'm going to move forward into what cyber operations is. So cyber operations has become increasingly important in modern warfare. So many nations have developed sophisticated cyber capabilities as a result of our basically our information revolution, and are incorporating them into military strategies. So why is that important? Well, cyber operations can be used to disrupt critical infrastructure. It can be used to steal information for intelligence purposes. And it can also be used to launch attacks on military targets. So cyber operations can be used to disrupt critical infrastructure. And critical infrastructure attacks have been a main component for mass casualty and fatality events in warfare. Government and militaries around the world are now investing heavily into cyber operations and increasing their capability. So what are some examples of cyber weapons? Well, malware, viruses, all types of malicious software that can be used to gain unauthorized access to another state's information systems. Another thing about cyber weapons is that they can remain hidden for large amounts of time, and they can strike when it's when they need to. Okay, so what are some benefits of cyber weapons? Now, I'm just talking here about why state-sponsored states would consider cyber weapons to be helpful in addition to or instead of conventional weapons. Cyber weapons can be used for precision targeting, so you don't end up having, things that are around being destroyed or civilian casualties, things like that. There's a lot of deniability there. You don't have footprints. You don't have that fingerprint. No one can really know that it was you that did it. So a lot of times this can bypass rules of engagement also. Strategic advantage in the ability to disrupt critical infrastructure. So in this case, just getting into an information systems infrastructure is useful in carrying out an attack just from an armchair across the world. So lastly, you don't have any direct casualties or fatalities when it comes to operating with cyber weapons. All right, so Ben, would you like to take it away with some key terms?
Yeah, so we've kind of been discussing some other terms, and this will go more into the second half of the presentation. Also, hybrid warfare, also sometimes referred to as fifth generation warfare, and it's a combination of offensive cyber operations with conventional or kinetic attacks. For example, knocking out defense network prior to an invasion, or a kinetic strike, knocking out communications or transportation systems, again, prior to an invasion. The Russians have really perfected this, and a lot of other nation states have also started to incorporate this in their overall strategic plans. So that brings us to strategic deterrence, preventing or mitigating overt hostile acts through a show of force. Basically, you show your capabilities. This can be done ambiguously, but also is done through defense security cooperation agreements like NATO, for example, or the former Warsaw Pact agreements. Another key term that will come up is because it starts getting into this legal, ethical, and moral gray zone with cyber operations, refers to dual use technologies. This includes like nuclear power, satellites, specifically GPS and communications, the energy sector, and transportation, as I mentioned earlier. The idea behind dual use technology is it has both civilian and military applications. So one of the big components of Iran's nuclear program, for example, is they say, hey, we want to use this for peaceful purposes to develop nuclear power. However, a lot of the same processes and technologies can also be weaponized. Again, satellites are used both by civilians and by the military, and the rest kind of goes without saying. Go to next slide. Some of the other, kind of key terms I wanted to kind of, as we're asking these questions, what is hybrid warfare, deterrence, dual use? How does that relate to the cyber arms race? And how are cyber operations used in hybrid warfare? I kind of gave you some examples. There was a Israeli operation called Operation Orchard back in 2007. There was basically 2 waves of F-16 fighters. That the first wave basically transmitted a malware code that disabled the Syrian air defense artillery and defensive positions prior to the second wave coming and launching an airstrike on a nuclear site that the Syrians were developing. So that was kind of the kickoff to it. We later know now Stuxnet. First, it sat there and kind of observed. Dr. Paul will go more into the technical aspect, but as it progressed, the malware evolved and changed to going from just disrupting the centrifuge operation to actually destroying the centrifuges, making them unusable. So, Dr. Paul, I'll go ahead and hand it back to you.
Okay, so thank you. When we're talking about hybrid warfare, we're talking about the use of conventional weapons as well as unconventional weapons. So the attack that Ben mentioned that happened in Syria in 2007 was conducted using that twofold strategy. So as Ben had said, the first wave of Israeli jets emitted a wireless attack to disrupt the signals in the Syrian aircraft before that second wave was launched to bomb that nuclear reactor facility. So the use of cyber weaponization strategically allowed the second wave of Israeli jets to enter Syrian airspace to fulfill their objective, which was to slow down the nuclear capabilities. So this was Operation Orchard, and with the use of cyber weapons and the conventional explosives, that would be an example of hybrid warfare. And this attack was to weaken the nuclear arms capabilities during that nuclear arms race between Israel and Iran. So basically, the wireless signal disruption in the Syrian aircraft with the combination of bombing the nuclear facility consisted of this kind of hybrid warfare attack in the context of a cyber arms race. Okay, so in a cyber arms race, As I said before, you have your conventional and cyber weapon systems. You use cyber operations, as I described before, as using code to perform what is called a denial of service attack, or reducing the availability of whatever systems are being, or operations that are being done. For example, destroying centrifuges in the uranium enrichment facility stopped their operations or slowed it down. We have cyber weaponization, which we talked about. You can use code to disrupt operations using denial of service, and targeting critical infrastructure, which is normally used in warfare. So how does a cyber attack start? The typical strategy, taking a 100-mile view, is it starts with reconnaissance. So reconnaissance is information gathering. You want to go in and find out how they tick, what kind of systems they're using, what companies provided them in supply chain, maybe even going into supply chain records to find out what kind of operating systems they use, what kind of devices, maybe who supplied those centrifuges, what kind of software is it using, different things like that. So this is what you'd find out in the reconnaissance phase. And that is typically where you'd find your vulnerabilities that you want to exploit. And so then the second stage is weaponization. So at this point, there's a custom weapon being created based off of what was found in the reconnaissance phase. So this is where you would look and see where the software, what kind of software are they using? Let's see if we can find a bug in there. Let's see if we can find some kind of way to exploit it, right? So that will include how you deliver it. So what kind of tactics, techniques, and procedures is this group going to use to get that malware into that system? And then once it's there, how do you exploit the system? How do you make it spread? How does it install itself on other machines? And how can you create a persistent covert connection to that network? So this is all a part of how cyber operations works to complete or fulfill a motive or objective. So let's see how that worked with Stuxnet. Okay, so after the initial reconnaissance phase, and I'm only just kind of guessing how it worked. I don't know exactly what happened, but this is what I discovered through research and just kind of knowing how cyber operations works. I've kind of put together this narrative. Okay, so it is said that the entire Stuxnet malware package, which had several functions, was delivered via USB because they had no other way of gaining any kind of connection to the network. And this USB delivery this physical device had to be plugged into something connected to the network, one of the devices connected to the network. So then it's hard to say how that happened. Was it through social engineering? Did maybe somewhere in the supply chain was this USB delivered? How did they gain access? You don't know. Maybe some of these scientists were a part of a convention. It's hard to say how the USB was delivered in there. It could also be possible that there was an insider, but not necessarily. There are many ways to get an item like a USB into a facility like that. And once it was there, it was installed into, once it was plugged in, there was malware that was in there that used a Microsoft LNK exploit. So this was a specific exploit that allowed whatever malware was in the USB to install itself on that specific computer. And this was an inherent Microsoft vulnerability. After that, the malware used a worm. It's the type of malware called a computer worm, which allowed it to spread to other computers. So this was also a Microsoft exploit called the print spooler exploit. And so that allowed that worm to spread itself to many different computers. And once it had, then the next objective was to find the computers that were running those centrifuges, that were running the software that ran that management console for those centrifuges, because people were they controlled those centrifuges via a management console. So Windows kernel exploit was used for privilege escalation that allowed that malware to enter into those main privileged computers that had control over those centrifuges. And those computers that managed the centrifuges had software. It was called Siemens Step 7. Okay, and there were a few exploits or a few vulnerabilities that were exploited from that software. So most of it happened from there, where it allowed access and authentication into the program logic controllers. It allowed a connection from one programmable logic controller to another. And so those exploits allowed control and access to the coding of how those programmable logic controllers in the centrifuges worked. So at that point, they made this, whoever was running the malware made the centrifuges run improperly. So they ended up damaging them or even destroying them. So that's how the disruption was conducted using Stuxnet. Okay, so that's the problem didn't end there. So Stuxnet is something that can spread itself, but it was also made available in the dark net after. The code itself was used to create many variants, and one of these variants is called Flame. And there have been several computers that have been infected with it, and this picture kind of shows how many computers were infected with it in this report. So Ben, would you like to kind of talk about some of these variants and then go into the research questions?
Yes, so this part is kind of the culmination and why we decided to pursue this project is, so Israel and the US demonstrated a very strong cyber capability in this attack. And now, because of the way the code was uncovered, again, it was shared internationally, and like Dr. Paul said, it's out there, it's everywhere now. Well, that includes going into Iranian hands, where now they can use this code, get their coders on it, tweak it, and then use it against their geopolitical rivals or hegemonic rivals. And it as we saw with the nuclear capabilities, and why we started with that is it's showing this back and forth on how this is cyber operations, or offensive cyber operations specifically, have started to escalate in a new kind of special weapons aspect. So that's kind of why we wanted to establish the technical aspect first, and kind of give everyone an idea of where this is going. And now I'll kind of get into what our research questions were, our methodology, and then on to some of our analysis and findings. So the three basic research questions we were operating off of, we were trying to keep it fairly focused, but we were having, because the limited amount of information, we had to kind of branch out. So begin with, it was how could Iran and Israel's escalation of offensive cyber capabilities equate to a traditional or conventional arms race? How do cyber operations influence each state's national security decision-making process? And then how does just war theory apply to cyber operations, especially regarding the targeting of dual-use technologies that we discussed earlier, or civilian infrastructure? Like I said, there's this legal gray zone, and we wanted to kind of examine that a little bit in the context of these two states' rivalry. Next slide, please. So the methodology, qualitative case study analysis, of previous work. There was a lot of, the majority of it was on Stuxnet, but we were able to find some other materials that kind of put Iran and Israel's decision-making process into context there. There was also an evaluative study of kind of the strategic deterrence elements within cyber warfare and hybrid warfare strategies, as well as looking at some of the legal, ethical gray zone, like I mentioned earlier. I focused predominantly on a lot of the social science theories behind the development of these programs and why it's escalating, and then removing, Dr. Paul was trying to remove some of the Hollywood ideas behind offensive cyber operations, and how do these things actually work? What are current capabilities to the best of our knowledge, and kind of go from there. Next slide, please. I'll try and move this along a little bit. So we examined what was publicly available on Iran and Israel's incorporation of offensive cyber operations, and some of the decision-making, looking back historically, using some IR theories on how and why these programs evolved, and then whether it has been effective in either deterring or then escalating the conflict between these two states. Like I said, the initial focus was on Operation Olympic Games, but I mean, there was not a whole lot that we could add to the body of knowledge on that. So we tried to expand our search into other cyber operations that the Israelis and the Iranians have conducted, where they vary and how things have kind of escalated within that offensive realm. Next slide, please. It's worth mentioning that the limitations of the study. A lot of the information is covert or classified. They don't want to let their rivals or even their allies know their full capabilities. So the availability information was incomplete. There's a lot of anonymity and deniability in all cyber operations, whether it's a black hat hacker sitting in his basement or a state organization. Attribution is really hard. Even then, Israel denies almost all operations, regardless if they're verified by external parties. Iran, they obscure a lot of their operations by using non-state actor proxies. and deny, removing state involvement, or at least overt state involvement. So that we also ran into some challenges with the reliability and validity of some of the information due to cognitive and perceptual biases within the research. A lot of, especially government documents, most came out of the US or other Western sources. So there was some inherent bias there, or Western centric thinking, and didn't adequately convey either the Israeli mindset or the some of the Iranian ideology going forward. So that also challenged some of our findings and made it a little bit more difficult. Next slide, please. So yeah, hopping into the analysis portion for the national security decision making, I kind of was going off of Thucydides' human behavior characteristics. Fear being irrational, honor non-rational, interest rational. Also examine the research questions from the prospect theory of cost-benefit analysis. Is the risk worth the reward? Do certain operations or certain activities deter or exacerbate the conflict? Also, rational actor theory, looking at it from, okay, how will they act in the future based on how they're acting now and in the past? And where's that consistency and coherency? Next slide, please. So kind of what I've determined is, or was able to determine, Israel uses cyber operations both in a irrational and rational manner. It's debatable whether it is rational, but again, I was trying to remove myself from the Western thinking and look at it from the Israeli perspective. And yes, there is a irrational fear because of Iran's very public and ongoing dedication to its eradication. Again, the interest derives from that fear, but it expands beyond, like with the Syria incident. Israel has a national interest of the preservation of the state and its national security. These cyber weapons are not just pointed at Iran, they point at non-state actor groups and state actor groups that threaten Israel's national security. Iran was a little different. This was a little more challenging to try and determine. It kind of ran the gamut. There's the fear aspect, or the irrational, is the small power competition with Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the US also, to a large degree. And it's Iran trying to rebalance or level out the balance of power, at least with its two closest rivals, and then be able to still take swipes at the US and other European states. Again, that kind of, the honor part also kind of goes into that. Iran's in a hegemonic battle right now through proxy wars throughout the Middle East, but it also is, in competition, like I said before, taking swipes at the US to decrease the power and influence of the US while raising itself up, even if it's not in a close competition. And then interest, again, Iranian desire to have weapon capabilities comparable to its rivals and defend or preserve the state. Next slide, please. So looking at the prospect theory aspect, to defend itself from kinetic or nuclear attacks, Israel felt it had to increase this fifth generation warfare, hybrid warfare, to increase its military capabilities and defensive capabilities. And then again, Iran was forced to, especially after the Stuxnet incident or Operation Olympic Games, they realized how much more they had to increase their offensive capabilities just to compete with Israel and anybody else that it was challenging. So going into the rational actor aspect, so I brought up the Israeli Kidon, which was the targeted killing program, because the Israelis do a lot of ends justifies the means and have a very pragmatic approach to their national security. And so they then, in this new hybrid warfare, unconventional cyber operations, saw themselves as needing to do this to better defend the state and mitigate the risk from their enemies. Iran's ideologically consistent, coherent desire to compete with rival states and destroy its enemies. Again, this was a little bit challenging when I tried to remain as objective as possible, but again, after that Stuxnet incident, we really saw how Iran basically upped their cyber game, and their former prime minister at the time, his name escapes me, I apologize, but he basically said, "Thank you, US and Israel, for using this weapon against us. You set us back a couple of months, but now we have this bug too. We can now use this bug. We have fixed all the holes. We are now harder to attack." So they really demonstrated that escalation, this new arms race. Next slide, please. So going into the just war theory and the moral ethics and legal aspects of using offensive cyber operations. Like I said, the Israelis are very pragmatic, and the end justifies the means, and will conduct preemptive strikes to threats that they see on the horizon. This kind of goes into the jus ad bellum, where they're using proportionate force. Stuxnet was the example. Iran has gone a slightly different route, mostly because they're a little bit still behind technologically on the cyber capabilities, but most of their activities aim at disruption and denial programs. But this again can escalate a DDoS attack or a denial of service attack on a piece of equipment at a power grid or a energy facility, knock out a power grid, and that's within their capabilities. And again, it's deniable. It's more often than not, there's limited collateral damage, but in the legal and ethical aspects is now you're targeting civilians in these type of attacks. So that was a lot of kind of what I started to see where the Iranians and the Israelis have been doing this back and forth, and kind of the reason behind developing these capabilities. And now I'll turn it back over to Dr. Paul for her analysis.
So as far as the capabilities have advanced on the cyber operations side, so based on the two attacks that we had mentioned, the Operation Orchard in 2007 in Syria, and Stuxnet, the Operation Olympic Games, both were proven effective. So after Stuxnet, Iran has responded by hardening their own defensive and offensive cyber operations capabilities. As we talked about before, there are variants of Stuxnet, one to include the name Flame. There are several variants, but that's one of them that became prominent. And Iran has been attributed to several attacks using these different variants of Stuxnet. Israel has been increasing its capabilities. I mean, it started in 2002, where they started a cyber operations program, and it's getting increasingly stronger. And so the IDF has been using these capabilities, especially using a group called Unit 8200. I don't know too much about them, but whatever information is out there, as far as I know, this is state sponsored. Iran has also increased its capabilities. So now cyber operations is a part of the Ministry of Intelligence. And they also have the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, involved in cyber operations. So both Israel and Iran have dramatically increased their cyber operations capability exponentially, and I don't see much of an end to that. I just think it's just going back and forth and remaining defensive against each other. So in conclusion, Ben has come up with on the decision-making process, there's a small power competition between Israel and Iran, and this demonstrates the Ben, would you like to talk about your conclusions, and then I'll bring up mine?
Yeah, I'll try and get through this real quick. Yeah, it was basically the small power competition I kind of discussed in my analysis, and it has kind of shown the necessity for both states to increase and improve their cyber operations, or at least the offensive cyber operations capabilities, to kind of deter and respond or preemptively strike at their rival. National interest, rational actor characteristics and prospect theory did play a significant role in both of their decision-making processes on developing and increasing these programs, especially under the jus ad bellum, like I said. Some of the considerations, though, are, how do we as an international community start looking at these special weapons, the cyber operations, in terms of jus in bello, or law of warfare, because of potential attacks on critical infrastructure and other dual-use technologies, the impact and potential collateral damage that could happen. I've worked on another paper that kind of does worst case scenario with that. And so that's also kind of has influenced some of my previous research, has influenced this project in seeing how far this could go where it hasn't quite yet, and no each actor being able to uh, uh, escalate it to that point where it doesn't even need to be a shooting war for there to be kinetic damage and civilian casualties. Dr. Paul?
So as far as capabilities go, I really don't see the cyber arms race going away or dwindling away, because as both actors have been increasing their capabilities, the amount of damage that can be done to continue this type of rivalry or war effort, the amount of damage has also increased. To the techniques that were used that were effective, the effectiveness of social engineering to allow for the USB delivery or gaining information. These are very sophisticated ways. People that fall for social engineering attacks aren't stupid, or it's not like something that can easily be resolved. These are very sophisticated techniques being used, and with the way everything works as far as acquiring materials or working with them, there are a lot of components and a lot of people involved. It's very difficult to control all of that. 0-day vulnerabilities, I mean, these are always going to exist, no matter what kind of computer system you use, what kind of software you use. There will always be some kind of exposure or vulnerability that will have to be continually monitored. So it's not like we can follow that castle and moat model back in the day where you just had to fortify your castle and everything that was inside was fortified as well. Now we have network connections using an information systems infrastructure has definitely it has definitely made things a lot more difficult to contain.
And that's pretty much it for our presentation. If there's any questions from moderators or audience.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that that presentation. It's really interesting to hear more about the more detail about how cyber attacks and cyber infrastructure issues come along. Okay, so let's pull up some questions we have. The first question, earlier you mentioned Hollywood ideas and quotes about capabilities and concepts when it comes to cyber technology and how it's used in warfare. What are some preconceived or erroneous notions you have come across in particular?
Dr. Paul, I know you love this one. we had about an hour-long conversation about various movies that we loved and hated over cyber attacks. So I'll leave it to you, Dr. Paul.
Well, in Hollywood, you need to have that drama aspect. You don't have someone sitting there just pitter-pattering away in their sweats for like 2.5 weeks to get one thing done. You know, in Hollywood, it's like, oh, get into the FBI. I'm in, you know, it doesn't happen that way. And so there's a lot of that going on, and it's just kind of, it's just irritating because someone will be like, oh, that hacker must work really, you can't work quickly like that. You know, it takes a long time to find out what vulnerabilities are. It can take months, it can take years. And so just being able to do something quickly is not enough. It doesn't go into the background of how information, you know, it doesn't really go into a lot of great detail. It just shows like in Liver, what was that with the Die Hard or Live Free or
Live Free or Die Hard.
Yeah, they just like pressed a button and all these like explosions happened and like someone hit the enter key and then suddenly it was, I mean, it was pretty outrageous, but I can see how Hollywood needs to have it that way, to have that drama show, you know, because it makes it more interesting, more sexy, you know.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I was curious about that. So thank you for answering. I appreciate it. We have another question, if you don't mind. The question is, can you speak a bit about the difference in infrastructure regionally across Israel versus Iran and how it would impact the cyber weaponry available?
So we'll probably tag team this one, but Dr. Paula, if you wouldn't mind if I start. Israel is, again, I apologize if there's a slightly Western-centric bias here. I have traveled to Israel fairly well, and I have done a lot of background research through previous work on Iran and some of its infrastructure capabilities. Israel is much farther along in a lot of industry and especially technology. A lot of Western microchips are designed, produced, and distributed from Israel. Israel is farther along in medical research and development. Their power infrastructure is a lot more reliable and expansive throughout. And so you look at like overhead imagery at night is kind of a big indicator. You know, Israel is very well lit up. Iran is a lot more sparse. So a Iranian cyber attack on the power infrastructure of Israel is going to impact a larger percentage of the population, whereas in Iran, a similar cyber attack would not necessarily have that great of an impact. And I mean, there's other aspects where again, because how much more Israel is reliant on digital and web-based technologies, the impact of a cyber attack is going to be that much more expansive. And you know, it goes everywhere from energy to transportation to communications, et cetera. And that's just kind of been my observations and from my previous research there. Dr. Paul, do you have anything to add?
No, I have nothing to add. That was well said.
Thank you for sharing your insight on that. Let me check and see if we have any additional questions. We have, we're actually streaming this on multiple platforms, so thank you for your patience.
No worries.
Oops. I'm currently not seeing any more additional questions at this time, but I hope it's okay if if people have some maybe personal questions or private questions you want to ask, they can reach out to you after the presentation. Do you have any last minute thoughts you wish to share at this time, or?
No, I mean, I know we plan on publishing the paper that goes a little bit more into the technical aspects and more into some of those national security decision-making parts. So once that's published, people can get a little bit better picture. I still, even though we had an hour and 10 minutes, I still felt a little rushed trying to get through some pretty heavy topics. But yeah, that we're hoping to have that out, or at least submitted for review within the next month or two.
Oh, that's wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. This is a very, very interesting, very complex topic. We appreciated how well you broke it down, and we look forward to your publication. Thank you so much for your time. And I'd like to thank everybody for attending this panel of the Middle East Dialogue. Thank you so much, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.